Well, welcome everybody. I can see attendees are starting to join this webinar. So welcome to those of you who are joining us, perhaps giving up some of your lunch break on this wonderful Tuesday afternoon here in Australia. We are very excited to present today three wonderful speakers working in visual multimedia in various shapes and forms. And we'll focus this session on AI and visual multimedia. I have tremendous pleasure in introducing our guests, and we'll wait to start once we've sort of maybe a couple of minutes. So first of all, our lecturer today or trainer today is TJ Thompson. Hi, Tim. TJ. TJ is a lecturer in visual communication. He's also a member of the Australian Research Council's umbrella group working on AI and automated decision making, and has been doing quite a lot of work around the intersection of AI and journalism, and particularly around photojournalism. So very excited to have you as our trainer today. We have Nicky Catley, who is the group picture editor at Australian Geographic. And wonderful Tim Kitchen, Dr. Tim Kitchen, who is the education specialist for Adobe Asia Pacific, who works across a huge range of industries, including journalism. And he'll be talking later in this session about some of the AI tools that relate specifically to video. So we might make a gentle start, which means I'll hand over to you, Tim. Please, friends, if you would like to put questions, you can do so. Just pop them in the chat box. Ignore the Q&A box, just pop them in the chat. You can also introduce yourselves. So if you would like others to know that you're here, the way to see who's in the room, but also to let people know that you're here, is to introduce yourself with your name, where you're based if you like, and that's also where you can pop any questions. Excellent. So over to you, TJ. Enjoy.
Thank you, Corin. Kind introduction. Thank you much. So it's really great to be here with you all, fellow journalists and folks interested in journalism and AI. Thank you, Corin, again for organizing this so well. You've been absolutely fabulous to work with. Such a pleasure to be here today with you all. So in terms of some learning outcomes that we're hoping to work toward today, we're hoping to give you an opportunity to have a play, if you haven't yet had a play, with some AI tools, a text-to-image generator and a text-to-video generator, and then have some conceptual understanding of some considerations that you should be aware of as a journalist or news organization for how to use these tools thoughtfully, ethically, effectively, responsibly in various ways and forms and shapes. So those are some of the learning outcomes we're hoping to cover today in our session. In terms of our agenda and some of the different things we'll work on today, so I'll give you just a tiny little quick introduction about myself, my background, to set the stage and the context. We'll chat a little bit about visual sources and try to compare AI and text-to-image generators and equivalent to some other ways that we traditionally get images or make images as journalists, and try to piece together some of the differences and similarities. We'll look at how do you make images, how do you generate images, we'll talk about prompting and how important prompting is to a lot of generative work these days. We'll also then talk a little bit about video and how to use video tools in this space. And then I can share with you some really quite fresh recent research. It was published overnight in Digital Journalism. So you're among the first audiences to hear about this new research that is able to get insights from journalists in the ground in 16 news organizations in 7 countries. How are they using generative AI visual tools in their newsrooms, and what do they perceive as the challenges and opportunities of those tools? So I can share that research with you at the end of the session, and hopefully the practical component, the conceptual component, and the research component can all be of use and benefit and value, hopefully, to you, your association, and your colleagues, hopefully. So that sounds like an all right plan for our time today. We'll press on with just a little bit of quick background context. So I'm not originally from Australia, if you can tell by the accent. I'm originally from the States, from the Rocky Mountain, Colorado region of the States, and I worked there as a photojournalist starting maybe 17, 18 years old, and continued to do that work as a photojournalist for a number of years throughout my college career, my grad school career, and a little bit beyond. Also worked as a designer, so hopefully trying to put some Viscom skills to use in terms of cameras and design and lots of good Adobe software, that kind of thing as well. So that's my professional background a bit. I've had the really good and lucky fortune of being able to work in communities and find ways to tell pictures, tell stories in newsworthy ways that are hopefully relevant and engaging and interesting to different news audiences, using my camera as the medium. had the good work of getting my work published in some of these outlets in the States and local, regional, national outlets over time. And I arrived in Australia in 2018, and I've been working as an academic here primarily since 2018. So generative AI is nothing new. It's been around for a number of years, but in 2022, 2023, that's really where we kind of hit a different point in the evolution of generative AI, where it became more of a common buzzword. You start to hear your parents, your grandparents, your friends talk about generative AI, chatbots, algorithmic search perhaps, and these kind of terms are starting to come into the common everyday parlance a lot more than they were a year and a half, 2 years ago. So my own first initial experience with generative visual AI came on what was then back in the day Twitter, when my colleagues on Twitter, my academic colleagues, were posting really interesting surreal images like the one you see on the screen here. So my colleague Axel Bruns, taking T.S. Eliot's poetry, stuff that's been written years and years and years ago, and feeding it into a text-to-image generator called Midjourney as a prompt and letting AI visualize what this poetry looks like. Really interesting, creative, I think, application of this technology, just having a bit of fun, seeing how the tool works, what it can do, using T.S. Eliot's poetry for this application. So this was my first kind of experience looking on social media, finding this type of thing out there. And it was very different to how I made images myself with a camera as a photojournalist back in the States. So being a bit of a nerd, I said to myself, like, how can we work with these tools in a research setting? I wonder how we can use them in a research setting. And I hope this is also relevant to our journalists and educators in the room as well. So my first kind of academic foray into this topic of generative AI and journalism in the visual scheme of things was this early experiment that tried to look at journalistic roles and how AI is visualizing these different journalistic roles. So before we get any further, let's have a quick little chat about prompts. If you've been to any of the other sessions in this series, you'll know that prompts are the input the user creates to get some kind of output. So if you're using ChatGPT, you can say, I want to know about XYZ topic, and it can then return an output that gives you more information about XYZ topic. But AI has evolved since then, and it's not just text input, text output. You now have text input and visual output. You have sometimes visual input and visual output, a lot of different possibilities here with AI generators. So back in 2022, when I was doing this initial work, I was curious to see how AI visualizes different roles. And you can see here on the top of the screen, the top columns, I have my prompts there. You can get your prompts as simple and minimalistic as you want, or you can make them as convoluted and complex and adjective laden as you want. So if you want to write sentences and paragraphs and describe lots of things about the scene, the characters, the setting, the time of day, you can put in all that detail. Or you can keep them really stripped back and really kind of bare bones and have just 1 or 2 word prompts, which is what I'm choosing to do here. And by doing that, by keeping it very minimalistic, I'm hopefully helping illuminate some of the biases and the ways that AI sees in particular ways. So I did this initial set of generations on the top 2 rows in mid-2022. I did that same process again, same keywords, same prompts, 6 months later, early 2023. And you can see there was an algorithm upgrade between Midjourney version 3 of the algorithm and version 4. And there's a very different visual style by default, without prompting for it, between the 3rd and the 4th algorithm versions. Version 3 is a little bit more painterly, a little bit more childlike, perhaps, in its rendering. It's more kind of bright colors, contrasting colors, whereas version 4 is a little bit more serious, a little bit more grungy, a little bit more restrained colors. So I'm not, again, prompting for any particular visual style here. I'm leaving it very open, very default here, but just an interesting in terms of just visual style between 6 months, version 3, and version 4. Now, when we start to actually look at the images themselves that are being returned here, who's a journalist? What do they look like? AI is having to do a lot of work to show us what a journalist looks like. Because nowadays, a modern journalist, it can just be a person with a smartphone. It can be a person with a laptop. And that doesn't necessarily look very much different to a lot of other professions and occupations. So AI is drawing on really old school technology, old school cameras, printing presses, that kind of thing, to make the point that we're talking about journalism here with our visual renderings. And if I ask folks to kind of look through the images and the different people being shown here, I'm asking you to think about who's being shown, but who's not being shown, and also how are they being shown. So hopefully some things start to make sense and become apparent for you as you look at these images. Things like, for example, the gender distribution of the sample. There's more women or female presenting people on the left of the red line that are on the right. So the roles on the left are quote unquote non-specialized. They're generic generalist roles, journalist, reporter, correspondent, the press. The ones on the right of the line are a little bit more specialized, more niche roles, news analyst, news commentator, fact checker. So AI is perhaps a little bit biased in that it's seeing women as being more on the non-specialized role, non-specialized side of the equation compared to the specialized side of the equation, which is obviously problematic. It's also seeing age, I think, interestingly. So there's some older men in the sample. They have wrinkles, they have gray hair or white hair, but we don't have women with wrinkles or gray or white hair. So a bit of an age disparity there, or an age bias with how the algorithm's thinking and working. Also, all the folks in the sample appear to be light-skinned, so perhaps an ethnic bias background here. So what all this is coming to is hopefully underscoring the importance of what's called training data. So the way that these algorithmic generators are working is the bulk of them crawl and troll through lots of content online. They consume all that content, they learn about it, they learn from it, and then they use that to inform these subsequent generations. So if we don't have very representative people who are developing algorithms and being software engineers in those types of roles, if we don't have very good training data that's very representative of all the different parts of our communities, then we're going to get outputs that aren't very representative across these different lines of age, gender, ability, even environment. So a lot of urban environments, a lot of skyscrapers and city environments, not very much, if any, regional, rural environments, not many country scenes and towns and environments being pictured here without prompting for them. So hopefully this little experiment was interesting and useful in terms of giving a little bit of a picture in terms of how algorithm sees things and how it can see things in biased ways. So that first study got published in Digital Journalism, yes. If you want the full 9,000 word version, there's that for you there. In this handout pack that Corinne has assembled for us, there's also the little Cliff Notes version. That's about 700 words, nice and simple, short read. If that's more your speed, either way. If that's of interest, that's a bit of reading for that early work there. So 2022, I was looking mostly at AI-generated content. 2023, last year, I was spending a lot of time interviewing journalists and hearing from them, how are you using these tools, if at all? What do you think are the risks and opportunities of these tools? So I was doing these interviews last year between April and October or so last year. We had to write up all the findings and do the analysis and go to peer review. It takes heaps and heaps of time. And then it just got published last night. So it's very much a long process. But we're able to share with you in a little bit of time the findings from these interviews. Hopefully, also, this is giving you a sense of how quickly or how slowly policy development in newsrooms and news associations is happening. And hopefully this is really encouraging and hopefully really comforting, because these are some of the biggest brands out there in news and media and publishing. And if they are taking a bit of time, they don't have all their policies out there and in place and publicly available in 2022 when this is all coming to a public kind of forefront. They're taking their time, 6 months, a year later, a year plus later. New York Times was just hiring for a generative AI standards lead in September last year. They've since filled that role. But these really big brands that have billions of dollars of revenue or multi-millions of dollars of revenue don't have all the policy development stuff worked out yet. So hopefully that's comforting to the little guys and little players in the outlet landscape, that you don't have to have everything kind of worked out and finalized yet. This is still a very fast-moving space, and we're trying to get our ducks in a row with policy development. So that was the first bit of work on AI-generated content. The second, as I've foreshadowed, is looking at people involved in AI-generated content or assessing content if they get it from user-generated sources. I was able to spend some time in Europe last year, in Berlin for a few months, talking to journalists in European newsrooms. I also had the opportunity to chat with folks here in Australia and in the States. We published that work in Journalistique, which is a English-German language journal. So our findings from the States and Australia are published in that journal there. It's a nice 3,000 word, relatively short read, not very academic. But if you want the full, again, 9,000 word version, there is one of those two available. 2024, just setting the stage for this year's work, we're trying to focus this year on news audiences and how news audiences what are they comfortable with? What are they not comfortable with? What do they think we should be doing or not doing with generative AI in journalism? I'll be spending some time again in Europe later this year, talking to news audiences to hear from them what they think we should do in this space, to hopefully feed some of that insight back to newsrooms as they are working on policies. So that's just a quick little whirlwind overview of some of this work that I've been doing in the space. I'm not at all the most productive in this space. Lots of other folks doing really interesting, relevant work as well, but just a taster of what we've done in this space so far. So we've gotten that context sorted, I think. The next kind of phase and section, I'm hoping to kind of compare for us of all the different ways that we can either make our own images or get images made for us or visual assets as journalists and news associations and organizations. How does AI fit into this larger landscape? Let's kind of compare the different sources of visuals that we can draw on and see how it compares. So some things I think that are hopefully helpful to work through are reflected in this little table that I've made and made available to you that Corin will be sharing after the session. So I put this together in a little Word doc. You can add rows, you can delete rows as needed. So I've put these different attributes I think are relevant on the template already. And I filled it out as I would as just a person myself, but these will be quite different potentially depending on your own attributes, your own experience, your own circumstances, or the circumstances of your organization. So for example, as a former photojournalist, I've invested a lot in my gear, as we do. We spend thousands of dollars on our lenses and our camera bodies and our peripheral gear. You spend a lot if you're kind of invested in it and doing that full time. So for me, it's a very, very, very low cost to make images with the camera because I already invested all that money a long time ago in the gear. And so only really what's a variable is my time. But in terms of the actual cost to myself, I already have the gear, I have all the equipment, I'm good in terms of the cost. That could be very different for you if you are in a newsroom that doesn't have equipment already invested. It could be a really high cost to try to make images with a camera, or if you don't have the staff or the skills, it could be very high cost for you. So it's a bit variable, a bit flexible, depending on, again, your circumstances. But after the session, have a little bit of a play and work through with this little bit of a table. Try to compare for yourself if I'm going to make the images myself or have my staff make them in the first column, if I'm going to commission the images and have a freelancer make them for me. That kind of changes things because I can do things on my own time as fast as I want to, but if I have to try to pay someone, a freelancer, to go out and do visual assets production for me, it's going to take more time. I can try to expedite the process if I pay extra for that time, but it's still going to take some extra time compared to making it in-house, usually. So have a bit of a comparison between making images yourself with a camera, getting them commissioned through freelance work or other sources, getting them online through a stock photography database, for example, using an archive or a library to get them. And then this last column, most relevant to today, is generative AI. How does it compare to using a camera, for example? So I think the two or three really critical considerations here. Cost is one. So if you don't have gear, if you don't have a skill, if you don't have time and equipment, the cost of generative AI is really low. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit more depth in a bit more time. But copyright is the other really big one I want to try to mention early on and often, because as I've kind of foreshadowed already, a lot of these generators, your Midjourneys, your Stable Diffusions, your DALLs, they work by crawling lots of copyrighted content on the web. And so it's a really big question mark in terms of if you have copyrighted content that's training the generators, who owns copyright to the resulting outputs that are being created? That's a really big question mark that's working its way through the courts in various jurisdictions throughout the world. Japan is a bit of an outlier. I don't know if we have any folks from Japan here, but they've decided in Japan not to enforce copyright on training data that is trained on AI generators. So a bit of a different circumstance in Japan, but still very much an open question for a lot of countries and jurisdictions. I think the New York Times versus OpenAI lawsuit is still very much going, and we'll see in coming weeks and months how that all pans out with the question of copyright. But that is really something to be aware of, and I'll give you some examples of some alternatives that are less risky from a copyright perspective as well in a slide or two. So again, have a play with this on your own time after the session and kind of compare for yourself, making images yourself, freelancing them, getting them online through a stock photo database or a wire source subscription versus AI. I think you can have a lot of a good discussion through thinking through some of these different aspects. Alrighty. So I'll give you just a little bit of context about some popular text-to-image generators, and then we'll have a little bit of a play ourselves with some popular text-to-image generators. Some of you might have already been old hats at this and done this a lot. Some might be quite new to this. So we'll meet you where you are and have a little bit of a play with this together. So I put together this nice, hopefully helpful table that shows some popular text-to-image generators based on my interviews last year with journalists. So of the photo editors and the folks in newsrooms who are working on AI, these are the generators that they're most familiar with using, and they have the most opinions about. So your Dollies, your Midjourneys, we've already mentioned those, Stable Diffusion, Adobe Firefly, Microsoft's Copilot, Generative AI by Getty Images, Google's Gemini, and then Canva. So you can see there's different costs involved. Some pay by the image or charge for the image. Some have some free trial images you can use. Some are by the month, lots of different options here. And again, I want to kind of mention copyright. There are these two kind of distinctions in the market, Adobe Firefly and Getty Images generator, that have made a point of distinction in the market by training on data assets that they either have proprietary data, so it's either assets they already own, or it's assets that they have licensed to use. So in terms of legal risk and copyright, if you're using text-to-image generators for publication, for public consumption, Firefly and Getty are going to be the less legally risky options from a copyright perspective. I'm not endorsed or paid by Adobe to say that, or nor by Getty, just putting that out there on the table, some context there for you. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense, if you don't already have that sense already, of some different ways you can turn to use some tools to make images. Now we'll talk a little bit more in a few slides about Google's Gemini and some developments that's happened with it in the past few weeks and months. But I think for today, I'd recommend having a play with Firefly or Copilot or Canva, perhaps. So if you don't already have accounts with those, maybe have a account created with one of those, you can have a bit of a play in a minute or two as we get into this next phase of the workshop. So we'll kind of head back now to talk about prompting, and then we'll have you all have a play yourself with prompting. So as I've already intimated and foreshadowed, you can be really super minimalistic and very bare bones with your prompts. You can just say simple noun, simple verb, whatever you want, just a one word or two word description if you want. And it can work with that, but it has to do a lot of filling in the gaps if you don't give it lots of context. So it's a bit of a trade-off. But as I mentioned before, you can add lots of context. You can add lots of really, really rich description. So you can say not just a street, but what are the qualities of the street? Is it a busy street, a slow street? Is it during peak rush hour traffic? Is it during midnight? Where is it located? What kind of GPS coordinates or city, state, country context, that kind of thing? What time period in the grand scheme of human history are we in? Are we in this century? Are we in the future? Are we in the past? How far in the past? What time of day? You can specify particular equipment. So if you say I want an image in the style of a Canon 5D fancy SLR that costs $10,000, you can put that Canon 5D camera make and model in the prompt. You can specify things like camera settings, so shutter speed, aperture value, all that really rich context you can kind of put into your prompt if you so choose. You can also specify visual style. You can also specify things like the horizontal and vertical perspective of the image that you want to be generated. So let's have a little bit of a look for ourselves, just with this little test case here. And I'll also just note at this point that we have assembled for you a hopefully handy prompting guide. Gives you some questions to work through and consider as you are making prompts of your own. So if you're not coming from a space that you feel terribly confident in this space, or you're not terribly visually literate, that's okay. Hopefully this prompting guide that will be sent to you after the session can be of some use. So here's what we get if we put in that prompt that I showed on the previous slide, and we'll kind of overlay that prompt on one side with the generation on the other slide. So folks in Sydney, curious to hear what you think. Let me know, is this quite accurate or quite inaccurate? Do you see this and think, yes, that's Sydney, I can tell it right away? Or is that perhaps a bit generic, perhaps a bit just, yeah, it's an urban landscape, but it's not necessarily very Sydney-esque? Curious to know what you all think. It definitely got the slow shutter speed prompt. So we got the kind of blurring of motion with that slow shutter speed of 1/15th of a second. Definitely got that picked up. But really the big glaring error here is the time prompt. So it got time of day, late in the evening, 7 p.m., but it didn't get the century prompt, the 19th century prompt. So that could be, we kind of need to maybe workshop that part of the prompt a bit more. Maybe we say during the 1800s, or during a particular year, 1830 or 1850, or that kind of thing. Maybe that's a little bit more explicit and easy for the algorithm to understand than referencing the 19th century, perhaps. And perhaps the exact number of meters isn't quite accurate either. We can quibble about that perhaps. But it gets some things right and not some things, depending on the prompt, depending on the available source material it's drawing from, depending on how the algorithm was designed. So lots of different things affecting the output here. So your turn. I've talked to you all for a bit now. Have a little bit of a rest for my voice. I'd encourage you to pick one of those text image generators we talked about. So your Adobe Firefly, Canva, Copilot by Microsoft. Have a bit of a play with one of those. And I'll give you 3 prompts that I'll ask you to work through. Now, Corinne has created this really lovely resource for us. She's done lots of resources. This one is the LinkedIn group. And for no other reason than to join it and see who else is in your field and who else is out there in your space doing this work. I would say join it for that reason alone, but join it also and post what you're working on in this workshop to that group so we can all see what we're doing together. We can all kind of reflect on each other's experiences, what works, what doesn't work, get tips and insight and tricks from different folks. That can make our interaction much more rich and vibrant. I know time is poor and short. We're time poor folks and time is short, but it really does help if we have that engagement, and it helps grow your network as well by seeing who else is out there in the field doing this work. So the initial prompt I had with this was, show me this different generator, Firefly, Copilot, or Canva, show me an internationally known person, a nationally known person, or a locally known person. I did all 3 of those in the initial prompt exercise. But then with Google Gemini, it in the last few months has stopped being able to generate images of people. So for that reason, I'm having it be either a person or place. So if you do want to use Google Gemini, you can use Gemini as well. Just if you are using Gemini, have it generate a person, sorry, an object or a landscape, not a person. But you should be able to generate images of people with Firefly and Canva and Copilot. Have a little bit of a play, take 5 or so minutes, and try to create these 3 different sets of images. Someone who's internationally known or nationally known place, nationally known, and locally known. See how you go. Let me know in the chat or post it in the LinkedIn group, ideally.
So we might give folks a bit of time, perhaps to just open those links in different tabs. I would expect that some people will be joining us with the session perhaps open in a tab while they're having lunch or carrying on with other tasks. And so what I would suggest, friends, is that just click on the links that are in the chat box, open them up, perhaps have a bit of a fish around. And if you do have time in the next couple of minutes to create an image, fantastic. And if you find yourself, well, haven't actually got time, but I do want to have a go at this exercise, perhaps set aside a few minutes sometime between now and the end of the day, or just leave the tab open and do it tomorrow, and then post your results into the LinkedIn group, which you're very welcome to join. And just to reiterate, just to make up time while people are having a bit of a play, that I will send a copy of the recording, the slide deck, handouts and links for the whole session to everybody who's registered via Humanitics. So not just the folks who are here on Zoom, but also people who weren't able to come but have registered on Humanitics. TJ, do you have, as we say in the cooking world, one I prepared earlier?
I do with that example of the Sydney street, but I can do another one live if you want me to do one live. We can try live and see how it works if you want
I
me
think
to.
that would be fantastic.
Sure. Yep. Give me just 1 minute, please.
And just while you're doing that, I will repost the link to the LinkedIn group, because I think we've had a few folks show up before since we started the webinar. So I've just reposted that link into the chat box there.
Thank you. Fabulous.
Excellent.
We're just getting into Gemini here. All right. Let me share a different screen here. Yep. So I am on gemini.google.com. I've logged into my Google account and I see this little prompt bar here down at the bottom. So I'll say, generate an image of the Sydney Opera House. Bit of a fan of opera myself, so we'll see what it can do with that prompt. Takes a bit of time to render those different options. Usually it gives you 4 different options, so you have a bit of a choice with some different options there. So we have 4 different options of the Sydney Opera House. I've kept it very bare bones, the prompt. I haven't said, from a particular perspective or focal length or distance. Kept it very, very, very generic.
Or acknowledging that there is, in fact, wave motion in the harbour.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Yep.
Good to acknowledge that.
Yeah.
So this is an example of something that's internationally known. It's an icon. People back in the States or in the UK know about the Sydney Opera House. Probably pretty easy for AI to visualize this type of thing because it gets so much documentation. People take photographs of it all the time. There's a lot of visual source material to draw on to be able to render in AI a synthetic version of the Opera House.
Excellent.
PJ, can I just ask a quick question? If I did that with Adobe Firefly, it wouldn't work at all because Sydney Opera House is actually it's a brand name, it's a copyrighted name. So I'd be very skeptical of any generated AI tool that actually does generate anything that is copyrighted. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great point. Thank you. Thank you, Tim. And that is a really good point to make. We were having a play, my partner and I, yesterday with the Adobe Firefly tool. And from my understanding, you knew more about this than I do, Tim, so correct me if I'm wrong. It is only drawing from the Adobe stock database, not from the editorial stock database. And so that really impacts what it's able to create images of. So it can get you really generic images of people in a room, in a boardroom, that kind of setting, that kind of thing. But it is sometimes limited by what it can generate based on how its training data are being compiled, but also what it has licensed to use. So I do think that there could be issues also, as you're saying, with what you're representing and if it is protected. So for example, I don't know about the Opera House itself, but I know the light system on the Eiffel Tower in Paris is also copyrighted. So if you want to sell commercial images of the Eiffel Tower at night with the light system activated, you'd have to go through and get permission of the folks who own the light system on the Eiffel Tower to be able to sell those images.
Sorry, I'm busily trying to give a prompt to Gemini. I'm asking it to create an image of Picasso in his blue period wearing a suit. So let's see what happens. While my computer's doing that, we might just wander on to the next section and see if folks, it is possible to share documents in the chat. You just click on the little sort of folded over piece of paper and it will allow you to upload things. If you want to, just keep it clean, obviously. So TJ, do you want to carry on?
Sure thing.
Thank you.
Corinne. Alrighty. So just a little bit of additional context about this. This example here I've shown on the screen comes from Midjourney, a different paid text-to-image generator. I've asked it a bit egotistically to try to visualize myself. What does RMIT University visual journalism researcher me look like? And it's gotten it right in a sense in that I'm light-skinned and I am male presenting, but it's not gotten it right in terms of it doesn't really look like me terribly. The haircut's quite different. I don't wear glasses. Doesn't really look like my face in any other respect or regard. So it can kind of get some things a little bit close-ish, but not terribly accurate in terms of what I actually look like. That being said, you can sometimes, depending on the generator you're using, define what's called a source image. So I can say, same prompt, imagine this person, but then I'm going to give you one image as a source prompt to give you a little bit of a head start and a hint about what this person actually looks like. Now, the way that generators work, they're trained on millions, hundreds of millions of images and assets, ideally. So you need really, really large data sets to make this work in really great fidelity and great detail. So with just one image, it's not going to be as convincing and realistic as it would be with hundreds, thousands, millions of images. But even just one image, it's a little bit more accurate than without the prompt, the image prompt. So you can see how it's drawing on the color of my shirt in the image prompt I'm providing it. It's making that shirt blue now. 2 of the images don't have glasses. I'm not wearing glasses in the prompt image. So you can see how that is kind of influencing in certain ways the generations that are happening with having that little one image provided as a bit of a hint to AI. This little example on the next slide is for fact-checking folks. Love our fact-checking folks in the audience. So one of the ways we would tell folks in the last year or 2 or 3, if you were doing, for forensic analysis and evaluation of images and trying to see if it was misleading, misinformation, disinformation, that kind of thing, you'd ask people to ask for multiple images from the same scene. You'd say, is it just a one-off image, or do you have different vantage points, different perspectives, a little bit closer, a little bit farther away, different angles? That can give you a little bit more confidence, perhaps, that this is actually an image that was made with a camera at a certain point in time, compared to just being a one-off illustration or photoshopped bespoke image that was created for a particular purpose. Midjourney and other generators are starting to incorporate features that allow you to change the perspective after you've created the initial generation. So you can say, I want this kind of image. I like the same image, like this person, this model, but I want to take a step back now, or 5 steps back, or 10 steps back. You can zoom out, you can zoom in, and it takes, it imagines more of the same setting. So it can be a little bit more of a challenge for fact checkers when you have multiple different images from different perspectives and angles of the same scene of the same model now being synthetically created. Just want to put that in there for the benefit of our fact-checking folks. One other thing I should mention, and you probably are experiencing this if you've had a play already with text-to-image generators, is oftentimes they're very clunky. It's oftentimes like using computers in the 90s, having to use like a terminal and type in commands to get what you want it to get. So it's oftentimes very imprecise in terms of what you want where in the generation. Now, Photoshop and some other tools that are not browser-based, that are embedded in tools on your desktop, give you a lot more control with, I want to particularly influence and impact this particular part of the screen or the image. They give that fine-grained control. But a lot of the browser-based generators that you see and use a lot, so your Midjourneys, your Geminis, that kind of thing, it is kind of a really rough, crude approach to say, generate an image of XYZ, but you don't have that fine-grained control of, I want this particular thing in this quadrant of the image. You can try to describe it, but it doesn't always get it right. So these folks in the States with Microsoft have come up with this little bit more GUI, if you will, graphical user interface, kind of drag and drop approach, where it gives you a little bit more control, just an alternative way to try to get a little bit more control with your prompts and getting them as accurate or as precise as you want them to be. So we've talked a fair amount so far about still images and text-to-image generators, but there's, of course, multimedia and video out there, and you can also do interesting things with AI and video. So we'll have a little bit of a chat at this point in the conversation about video and moving images. So as you can expect, there's heaps of different options, dozens and dozens and dozens of different options from lots of different providers out there, some free, some paid. One of the ones that I've tested more is Runway, and heard better things and think it's a bit better in my own opinion. So Runway is you can either do text to video, you can put in a prompt and get a video in response. You can also upload a source image and animate or create some motion with that source image that you upload. So I don't think we'll have time in a session today to have you do a hands-on try with this, but we'll give you in your homework an opportunity to have a play with a text-to-video generator as you have time. If you have been keeping your ear to the ground on social media, you'll have heard about Sora, which is OpenAI's text-to-video generator. Really interesting, quite impressive generations from my perspective. But the thing is, it's not available to the public yet. So we'll see if it's just a bunch of marketing hype, or if it is, in the coming weeks and months, actually as good as some of the renders appear to be once it goes out of closed testing and more into the public sphere. So Runway, if you do have a play later, I'll just give you a quick little demonstration of Runway, how it works. As I mentioned, you can either start with text and create a prompt with text to create a video in response, or you can define a source image and let that be your starting point. So I'll show you both options. I'll do both ways just to get a sense of what it's capable of. First option is, here I have a photo I made in Japan recently, in Nagano, Japan, a lovely skiing village in Japan. So this was on the side of the road, some of the ski slopes in Nagano. I put this as the source image in Runway, and I've asked it to animate it for 4 seconds. 4 seconds is the free version that you get, so I get a 4-second video in return. Just a little tracking shot from one side of the screen to the other, get a little bit of motion, a little bit of tracking, going across and seeing that image animated. So that's an example of Runway, what it can do when you define a source image. You can also, though, start the other way. You can start from text and have a text prompt that you then try to get it to create a video in response. So I've tried to describe that photo that I took myself. So tracking shot from left to right, snowy mountains of Nagano, Japan, clouds hanging low around the mountains. They're about 50 meters away. And this is the resulting video that Runway creates for you. So same kind of feel. It's doing the same thing with the tracking motion. But the really big difference is, I think, the atmospheric conditions. I haven't done very well describing the atmospheric conditions. It's more snowy and cloudy than it is in my prompts, and it's also lower on the ground than the prompt version. So I should specify the vertical perspective. I should specify more of the atmospheric conditions if I want those to be taken into account with my prompt in this little video example. So do have a play. We'll give you a homework exercise if you want to have a play with that on your own time after the session. So that is the kind of practical part of the workshop, the text-to-image generator and the text-to-video generator. The last little bit here in the last 20 minutes is the latest research just published last night in digital journalism with insights from journalists. How are they using or not using these tools? What do they perceive as the challenges and the opportunities? I think it's good to start with the challenges and the risks first, tackle that big meaty area first, and then hopefully end up on a bit lighter, more creative, perhaps positive note with some opportunities perhaps. So again, this is based on interviews with 20 journalists at 16 leading news organizations in 7 countries. I don't have permission from them to disclose which outlets they are, but I can give you a sense of their size in terms of their national or international reach. A lot of these are really big, well-resourced organizations. So don't feel bad if you're not doing this or you can't do this, because these are organizations that have really big budgets. So don't feel intimidated if this isn't you. But I think there's lots of things we can draw on for medium and smaller outlets in this sample as well. So this is from journalists, what they're telling me in terms of here's what we're seeing as the challenges of generative visual AI. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, is the challenge and the risk, the potential for mis and disinformation. So the World Economic Forum has named the risk of mis and disinformation as the world's greatest short-term risk, and it's put that risk above other really pressing risks like armed conflict and natural disaster, which are also really, really important pressing risks. This is an election year in lots of countries, so the risk of misleading and deceiving people through AI, through generative AI, is the preeminent challenge according to journalists that I have spoken to. We saw an example of that here in Australia. There were some user-generated content that was AI-generated that found its way onto the Adobe stock platform, and it wasn't labeled as such. And then we had some news outlets in Australia that were using those images that were purporting to show the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and really kind of troubling use there of imagery that was altered, synthetic, fake, that wasn't being labeled as such. So photo editors are sometimes caught out by stuff being on platforms that aren't necessarily labeled as they should be, or labeled appropriately. Something to be aware of as you are doing your day-to-day work, because I know we're all very busy doing this work. So not wanting to mislead and deceive folks, that challenge of misinformation, that's the most prevalent. Also, understandably, being concerned about labor implications. So not wanting folks to lose jobs or have labor displaced, that was the second biggest challenge that folks perceived. And I think part of the reason here for this fear is if we start to look at how much these generators cost to use, there's not a massive cost by any stretch of the imagination to use these generators. Some of them, as you've already seen, are free. Some of them you can get a commercial enterprise grade license for your organization for how many ever hundreds of employees, how many ever hundreds or thousands of generations you want in a whole year for about $1,200 for the whole year. Now, if I'm paying a freelancer, I might pay them $400 a day rate for a freelancer's work. I can pay for 3 days of a freelancer's time to do maybe 8 to 12 images for a package that they produce for me, or I can get a Midjourney subscription for the same price for a whole year. And I'm not saying that cost is the only thing. The dollar amount's not the only thing for certain and for sure, because there's definitely value in human labor, and there's definitely value in the skills and experiences you have as journalists doing the work you're doing on the ground. Because AI is not great at local content. It can create content of Donald Trump or really well-known people and scenes and scenarios, but it can't create pictures and videos and assets of me or you or people down the street. And these people need to be seen and to see themselves in the news, I would argue. So it's not really representative in terms of who it's showing or who it can show. We've already kind of mentioned copyright implications. I've already mentioned Adobe and Getty as being 2 ones that are less risky in terms of copyright. There are emerging technical ways called data poisoning, or you can insert quote unquote poisoned pixels into your images, and that confuses how generators learn from the images. So if I take an image of a cow, I put some poisoned pixels in, the generator then might think instead of a cow, it's showing a car. Completely different, not an animal, completely different topic that's being represented. That can really mess up how the generator learns and then creates new content based on how it's learning from previous content. So we'll see how widespread this is. It might just be something that, you know, is a drop in the bucket, doesn't really go anywhere, or it might be something that happens a lot, depending on how things go in the coming months. But data poisoning in the conversation in the handout pack for you if you want to have a little look at that use case. It is, I think, no surprise, really difficult and challenging to see when images or videos have been altered or manipulated or edited or completely synthetic. So an example of this that you might have seen in the last couple of weeks, making its rounds on social media, is this video.
Some people are losing their minds because the video below would be AI generated.
So he's speaking with some gestures. It's not just this very static, stiff head. He has gestures below the head. He's blinking. All the kind of things that were telltale signs a few years ago have been kind of corrected and fixed.
Some people are losing their mind.
Up, and I'll just go to one more slide ahead. If I slow things down and look at it frame by frame, you can see that Obama's wrinkles disappear just kind of arbitrarily if I slow it down and look at it frame by frame. There's not always going to be these visual tells. This is not a failsafe, but sometimes you can pick up on little anomalies if you do take a bit of time and slow down and look at things in a bit more depth. So algorithmic bias, we've already mentioned that, I think, quite a bit. So I think we can kind of move on fairly quickly from that. I will just note people try to work with this and mitigate it by putting in what are called wrappers. These are things that sit between the prompt that you put in as a user and the output that the generator spits out in return. So in this case, the wrapper is invisibly influencing what is coming out of the generator by trying to get more ethnic diversity in the outputs. Now, in principle, that's a good thing. We want to have ethnic diversity. We want to have not just white folks or light-skinned folks. That's a good thing in principle. But then in practice, when people start asking for different contexts, it can get tricky and hairy. For example, Black Nazis or Asian Nazis. That didn't happen in real life. That wasn't realistic and accurate. And so that kind of desire for representativeness can sometimes go awry depending on the application. So that's why Gemini paused development of its tool to be able to generate images of people because of these perceived issues with representativeness. Reputational risk, that's an issue there. 9 had a bit of an issue with this earlier in the year. Just to show you how, if you don't already know how this kind of thing can happen, if you have a really tightly cropped or tightly composed image, in Photoshop, there's this new feature called Geographic Expand. You can kind of crop out instead of cropping in, and it can imagine what happens beyond the borders of the frame. So in this case, it has to imagine a lot about what the person's wearing because it doesn't really know what's happening beyond the frame. So it's giving you 3 different options to choose from. Those are the 3 different options there. That's more or less what happened with the Georgia Purcell case. Enough said on that one. We had AI being used to remove watermarks. We had, not in journalism, but in marketing, we had AI-generated images being used to promote an arts organization and making headlines for that use. So we have just a few minutes left, so I'll just make this brief, some opportunities here. My participants felt most comfortable with using AI for non-photorealistic generations. So if things were clearly not photorealistic, painterly, that kind of thing, they felt a lot more comfortable like this kind of thing here than with photorealistic generations. They felt more comfortable with generative expand when it was of a landscape than of a person. They felt more comfortable with that use case. They found potential for using AI for graphics, data visualization, that kind of thing. So instead of creating a model of Notre Dame yourself, spending lots of time and effort to do that, you might be able to put in architectural renderings or schematics or blueprints and have AI create the model for you that you can then use in storytelling to tell a story about, in this case, how the fire spread. Past and future of AI, using it to visualize what we've already done in the past or where we might be going in the future. This is an old photo from a couple hundred years ago in WA of the ship Sydney, just using it to kind of animate it and get a little bit of motion on the waves and the ship there, that kind of thing, giving you a little bit more life and dynamism in the photo. This is a probe that hopefully will get to this asteroid in 2029, but we've never seen the asteroid. We don't know what it looks like. It's using an illustrator NASA is using an illustrator to render what the asteroid might look like, Could you do the same thing, work with an AI tool as an illustrator at NASA and have some kind of similar thing, perhaps? So I think we are at the end here, just automating workflows, that kind of thing as well. Some other use cases, recognizing faces, putting in metadata and captions, that kind of thing. Automating layout, we're seeing a little bit of that being used as well, depending on the outlet. So a lot of potential here, a lot of challenges, but also a lot of potential for different sized organizations. So that's a whirlwind of that. We can, I think.
TJ, could you just bounce back for a second, because you're way ahead of yourself. You've still
Okay.
got 10 minutes, which is
All right.
terrific. So just let's pull out some of the things here. I think you know, we've talked quite a bit about image generation, but then there are also processes that sit around photography, videography, and you mentioned here, for example, metadata. Or automated layout. As far as I understand, some news outlets are beginning to use prompts to train camera angles or choices of shot, for example. So perhaps we could talk just a little bit about some of the sort of associated things around distribution, production, compared to just content creation.
Good point, Corinne, with pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's pick up on the metadata point. So as a photojournalist or someone who's doing production back in the day, you'd have to what's called ingest all of your assets. And I'm sure Nicky and others are familiar with this and do this with their own digital asset management systems. So you have your photographer bring in their assets, their image files, their video files into the server, into the digital world, and embed it with lots of rich context and metadata. So I'd say, this is an image or a video of this person with this title, with this affiliation, taken at this time, at this place. In these conditions and circumstances, you put all that in the caption, you put keywords in, that lets you be able to tag and find things more easily. It helps you build a rich archive of content that you can then go back and find for file photos or file art, file assets, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of workflow that happens when you get new assets to be able to use them again and put them in your system and have you be able to find them. So instead of doing that all manually, it would take 30 minutes or so to do it all manually myself every time I had an assignment and a shoot. You can perhaps in some places turn to AI and have it kind of recognize, oh, that's you know, the premier's face or the prime minister's face. I recognize that face. I can kind of automatically put that in the caption or the keywords, the metadata automatically. I can recognize that's Parliament House. I can recognize that's Sydney Opera House, wherever it was taken, perhaps. Obviously, you don't want this being done just by a machine by itself. You want what's called human in the loop. You want to be able to have someone verifying and yep, that is the Parliament House, that is the premiere, that is, you know, the right time and date, all that kind of stuff is correct. But if it can automatically do that for you or do it more efficiently than you can, why not? If it can kind of speed up workflows, make things more efficient for you, that's a really nice use case on the pre-production side before you even get into the editing and publication side.
Wonderful, thank you. There's also a question in the chat box. When you showed the ship Sydney earlier, it appeared the name of the ship, bottom right, had changed.
Yes.
Am I seeing things, or was there a reason for that happening?
Good pickup. Thank you for that observation. So AI generators are notoriously bad with fingers. They've gotten a lot better in the last 6 months with fingers and rendering anatomical details of humans, but they're also really bad historically, have been, and probably still are for few reasons, with rendering text. So just like hands, text is also really hard to render. It's really delicate, it's really fine. And so oftentimes it will kind of just get things a little bit more glossy and not as accurate as it was in the original. So that's a little bit of an anomaly with generators. It's not really great with working with text. It has progressed in the last 6 months to a year, but it still has a long way to go with rendering text and fingers to a really high degree of fidelity.
Fantastic, thank you.
Thank you for that pickup. That's good.
Yes, yes, your eyes work, Anthony, and we all live in sunny, or some of us live in sunny Sydney. Do you want to? Yep. I know you've prepared some wonderful homework activities, TJ.
Yes.
You know, such a wonderful blessing. I think, you know, working with trainers like TJ, who are lecturers in university settings, you know, the quality of these homework activities is really high. So, would you like to talk us through this one?
With pleasure. Thank you,
Thank
Corinne.
you.
So this one, I'd encourage you to find a recent news photo. You can take it, or you maybe have a colleague who's taken it, or someone else in your association, or just by a journalist, and try to describe it for us in as much detail as possible. And oftentimes, if you're not coming from a visually literate place, that's fine. But oftentimes you'll kind of just focus on the who, what is happening. So the subject and the verb. So it's, you know, person in the frame and they're shoveling snow, or they're at the beach swimming, that kind of thing. Those kind of talk about who's in the frame and what they're doing. But I think we can go much further, and hopefully this activity helps us go much further in terms of being more visually literate, having more vocabulary to draw on. We have heaps of questions here to consider and to draw on to hopefully help inspire you. So think about things like, you know, if I had to think about what lens is being used to make this image, is it from really far away? Is it a telephoto lens that's kind of compressing things, making things appear closer? Is there, you know, shot at the field? Is there deep at the field? What's the quality of light? What are the light sources? What's the color temperature? All sorts of different things we can kind of think about and describe in really rich depth. And you can see and hopefully appreciate with that example from Nagano, I thought I was doing a good job on the first blush describing what I wanted, just saying I want tracking shot left to right, using that technical terminology, tracking shot, good on TJ, using, you know, the location, Nagano, Japan, mountains, clouds, that kind of stuff. I was getting everything I thought I needed, but really you actually need a lot of description to get something if you want a lot of accuracy. So I think this first activity helps you think about your vocabulary, think about your literacy choices, and hopefully cultivate those. So that's option one, is finding a recent news photo, trying to describe it in these really complex ways so that you can perhaps then use that as a prompt, which leads into the second activity, which is recreating a photograph using AI. So a really fun challenge, a really hard challenge, but a fun challenge, is scroll through your little smartphone camera roll, find an image, could be an image of your pet, your partner, your work, whatever it is that's on your camera roll, and try to recreate it using a generative AI tool. So a text-to-image tool like Midjourney or Gemini, Firefly. See how easy or hard it is for you to do this. And it, again, depends on what the subject matter is. If it's a really famous person or place, it'll be easier than if it's a not famous person or place. But again, see how clunky or how easy it is to be able to work with recreating a photo using AI. And I think that can underscore and it complement the other activity about kind of working through that table with the considerations of if I'm using a camera to make an image versus I'm using AI to make an image, some of the differences really become quite apparent and quite clear using this type of exercise and approach. So that's the second little activity. Third one is something I think is really important for all of us as news workers. So if you don't have policies already in place, that's probably a kind of a wake-up call. Let's get some policies in place. Let's get some kind of principles, at least, or policies that help inform how you and your colleagues and staff will use these tools or how you won't use these tools. As you can all appreciate, we want to be good stewards of the public trust. And so if we can tell people transparently, here's how we're using these tools, or here's how we're not using them, here's what we will do, won't do, here's, you know, the how, when, why, where, all that kind of stuff, that's really, I think, useful and beneficial. Pointer, it is a US-based organization, but Pointer in Florida in the States, recently in the last week or two, created this lovely template that is a nice starting point for organizations trying to create a policy around AI use in newsrooms. So have a little bit of a Google search for Pointer generative AI template and see if that might help inspire how you go about this in your newsroom. Maybe you already have a policy in place. Maybe you can kind of think about tweaking it or refining it perhaps based on some of the stuff we talked about today. It's also good to learn from your colleagues. So if there are other associations out there or outlets out there, have a look at their public-facing policies. What do they say they will do or not do? How does it compare with your own kind of ethos and mantra and ethics and that kind of thing? And have a bit of a comparison. So I think that's a nice opportunity for a more kind of introspective look at policy and AI. And the final one is video. So having a bit of a go with Runway or an equivalent text-to-video generator or image-to-video generator. You can do that kind of thing I was showing you earlier, where you have a photo you've taken, trying to get some kind of motion applied to the photo. You can say pan, roll, tilt, zoom, etc. Or find a news headline. So we have really great headline writers out there writing really interesting headlines. See how it goes with visualizing that headline in a text-to-video generator like Runway. So those are 4 hopefully fun, interesting activities to do when you have a bit of time to have a bit more of a play in this space. Is that helpful, Corinne?
Oh, so fascinating. And I've just been playing around with Gemini while you've been speaking and posted an image to the LinkedIn group. So
Fabulous. Thank you.
yeah. And it's wonderful too to have a range of activities. So folks, if you've got time to do all 4, great. If you want to focus on one in particular, that's also fine. TJ, if you like, you could stop sharing and I might just reintroduce our guest speakers. First of all, Nicky Catley, who is a group picture editor at Australian Geographic, and will come shortly in about 15 minutes or so to Tim Kitchen, who's with Adobe APAC. But Nicky, you've published in Australian Geographic some AI work and had some reactions from audience. So do you want to tell us a little bit about the kinds of forays you've made in this space and what the reaction has been? And you're on mute. If we all had $1 for everything, every time we'd said that since 2020, we'd all be wealthy. Yep. No, you just need to unclick your little microphone. There you go.
Okay, so I guess first I would say that we don't generate images using AI. We don't do that, but we do report on the issue, and I put forward an AI image to talk about in the magazine because I'm always interested in new ideas, new ways of telling stories. You know, I'm very aware of compassion fatigue, of the audience needing to be entertained, and fresh ways of telling the same story we tell day in, day out. So I'm always interested in new ways, you know, expanded documentary. But we looked at this. We looked at the issue of AI more generally across the magazine. So we looked at AI in the conservation sector, data sets, what uses it has for you know, the environmental challenges ahead of us. It was a really optimistic and positive story. So at the same time, I took the opportunity to really tackle look into the issue of AI imagery. I kind of feel that photo editors, it's part of our responsibility to acknowledge new technologies, and I didn't know much about it, so I took the chance to really research it. And we profiled an image of an Australian AI artist who's actually an ex-photojournalist who worked in Melbourne for one of the newspapers. And she's really interesting because she uses, you know, a lot of analog processes in her mainstream work. And she's a nature photographer. And she, because she's very conscious of animal welfare, she's alert to issues around ethical issues around shooting animals, so not putting animals at risk, or you know, harming the subjects in a photo, which is very common in wildlife photography. You know, very photographs of reptiles in bright colours and looking alert often means they're stressed. So so she was using photography as a way to you know, new ways of not harming subjects and raising issues. So I profiled this photo, it wasn't a photo, sorry, this artwork, AI image, and the reaction from the audience, the backlash was extraordinary. It was the same month, I think, that the AFR Power issue also put out an AI themed issue, and they experienced a similar backlash. So we used the image in the context of exploring AI, and we labeled and analyzed the image. So what happened is the audience didn't read it, or if they were on social media, they didn't, maybe they were doom scrolling, they didn't pay attention to the caption or the label, and that really worried me. And what it did also is it reminded me that images embed in our memories in a kind of emotional way, in a different way than text. So people were remembering and talking about that issue and about our story, but remembering the image, but not remembering the copy. So these were all these red flags for how we were to proceed going forward in our company with using AI. So we don't use AI. We report on it, but we don't use it to generate imagery.
So when you're thinking about editors and broadcasters who maybe beginning to think, will we, won't we use this kind of context and in different sorts of use cases? And TJ, I was really interested in some of the potential use cases that people perhaps within journalism feel comfortable with. For example, recreate, you know, a moment from the past or introduce animation into an image. How do we really perhaps need to think about alerting audiences, given perhaps we may need to alert them in more than one way if we're relying on someone seeing a small caveat at the bottom or something in a caption? How are we having to make our policies more accessible and obvious?
Do you want to go first, Nikki? I'm happy to go first, or you, either way.
You go. I'm interested.
The New York Times, for what it's worth, does watermark its images that are AI generated and says AI generated as a label on top of the image itself. And so there is a visual little indicator on the image itself saying this is AI generated, and that gives you a little bit of a clue without having to look in the caption. I think that could be weaponized, and people could use that to try to discredit traditional news media and say a traditional photo is AI edited when it's not. So I think it's not, you know, fail safe, nothing is. But I think explicit labeling on the image itself perhaps is more visible and more helpful to audiences than just putting it in the caption.
Thanks, Tim. And it's certainly, I suppose, when one thinks about situations where an image might be downloaded and re-uploaded somewhere else, at least that burnt-in watermarking comes with it. Yeah. Nikki, did you have some thoughts?
Oh, well, we look in our organisation. We take great pains to have fact check our credits and our captions. Everything's very thoroughly, you know, in the journal, there's long lead times. Everything's very, very thoroughly researched and verified by independent fact checkers. So, you know, the label and the caption will be accurate. But when it comes to social media feeds, it's a little bit different. So in our organisation, there's only one photo editor. In National Geographic, there's 23. So I can't be all over the social media feeds. So I have a cheat sheet. I have a training manual for anyone involved in making visual decisions, so the social media editor, about the imagery that they're reposting on that. And it's much more vulnerable to fake imagery slipping in, I think, social media, because we are reposting imagery from other posters who we haven't commissioned, who haven't been in the field. We don't know their backgrounds. Quite often they're not paid. It's a repost. So they're not bound by contract, and they're not bound by, they're not accountable to a code of standards. So it's the social media area where I feel like we're most vulnerable. And the ways to tackle that are really constantly training and understanding verification tools and taking the time to do that and looking at imagery with a perspective of why shouldn't we post this?
Yeah, no, fair enough. I'm just noticing there's a few questions popping into the chat box, which I'll come back to in a moment. But I am also just want to mention to folks that Nikki needs to head off in about 7 minutes. And so if you do have a burning question, please pop it in the chat box. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about, if you're a practicing photographer, what sorts of things perhaps do you need to be keeping in mind about your practice, the way that you would make clear what tools you're using, how you're going about your work, how you might demonstrate that in pictures, for example, to editors like yourself? What would you be looking for?
Well, I would need to know that a photographer that we commission are bound by a contract. So you know, they can't alter imagery, they can't insert or take images elements away in a photo in post-production, and they can't stage photography when they're in the field. They say, for example, I've got a preconceived story idea about something that I've dreamt up at the desk. I've commissioned someone and said, go and photograph this, and they need to know, and I need to be able to trust that when they're in the field, that they won't think, oh, I've got to make this happen and contrive an image because this is the preconceived story idea. They need to have the intelligence, the wit, the ability to move with the story and observe reality as it's unfolding in front of them, and pivot with the story if it changes. So that's what a photographer, I would ask a photographer to do, and that's the benefits of being in the field and I guess not using AI, and be able to find new stories once you're in the field off the back of a story you're doing.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about is the opportunities. If you think about some of the ways in which these technologies might impact production or distribution, have you begun to explore those at Australian Geographic, or is that sort of on your to-do list for 2024?
Yeah, look, not on the production level. I'm very interested in that. I will research that more. The thing is that we would never use something like generative fill because of perhaps the issues that we've seen with Channel 9, and the politician being given a crop top, and that's a real argument for having a human, like a specialist photo editor or someone who who's made that change using it. Like there's a human hand that used AI. So we're very, 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 very careful around our choices. We think very hard. We're critical thinkers. A photo editor is not just a booking agent or a traffic manager. We think critically about the image once it arrives, from the photographer's camera. We don't, I always advocate not cropping because that really changes what the photographer's seen in the field, but of course things do, you have to, designers need to, but the production process with AI, that's something I need to research further probably. But what I do like about AI is the possibility to tell stories that, we just can't tell because we can't access those areas, or we can't put a vulnerable animal, which is, our wheelhouse is nature, put that animal at risk, or we just can't find the animal. Yeah. Some animals, for example, northern hairy-nosed wombats, there's only 300 left, and they're notoriously hard to document. So how do we tell their stories and raise awareness about biodiversity loss? How do we do that unless, we use illustration?
That's really exciting. Thank you so much. I'm mindful that you're on a tight deadline at Australian Geographic, so I might...
Oh, I can stay for 15 minutes if anyone's got any questions.
Excellent. So friends, if you do have questions for Nicky, please pop them in the chat, and we might gently segue to Tim Kitchen, who's joining us from Adobe APAC. So Tim is the senior learning specialist at Adobe for our region, is going to talk us through some of the tools that perhaps certainly in newsrooms I've worked in, Adobe is one of the suite of a range of available brands that one might consider engaging with. And so if you're using them, or and some of the learning is obviously transportable if you're using other types of software, for example, the Mac suite, etc. So with that in mind, Tim, you have some slides that will talk us through some of what's happening with your organisation. If you wouldn't mind sharing those, that would be wonderful.
So the first slide, as I bring it up here, and hopefully you'll be seeing this very soon, is just to let you know that we've been using AI at Adobe now for a long time. So it was 2016 when we launched what we called Adobe Sensei, which is our AI engine. And let's not get that confused with Gen AI, which is a relatively new in terms of the world knowing about it. But Gen AI has been around for quite a long time. We only just incorporated Gen AI into our tools last year. So it's very new technology right across the board. If we think about it, ChatGPT was only November 2022 when it first was launched. So it's really, really new technology. And as TJ was saying, it's still really developing, like to fingers and letters. It's improving almost every day. When I create something, I notice the improvements. when I'm using the tools. So to give you an example of how we're using Adobe Sensei, for instance, if I jump into Photoshop, just to give you a little sample, I won't do the Gen Fill one because TJ did a really good example of that. But when I do this demo, normally I will just make it wider, make this portrait image into a landscape. And if you're familiar with Dramana in Mornington Peninsula looking towards Mount Martha, it recreates Mount Martha and it does an incredible job. It's like magic. It just blows me away. But what I love about this photo is not the fact that it's my daughter on the right. It was taken with my very first iPhone. So my daughter got married 2 years ago. That's how old this photo is. And what I loved when I first took that photo was I thought it was fantastic in terms of the coloring, but by the standards of today's iPhones, it's terrible. It's just all washed out. And so AI is really helpful in helping enhance images that you're not quite happy with really quickly. So in this case, what I'd probably do, and I'll just relayer that, is I'd go up to a filter and maybe use the Camera Raw filter, and it'll bring up a window like this, and you'll see all the different settings. And if you're a Lightroom user, which is what a lot of professional photographers are much more familiar with Lightroom than they are with Photoshop, you'll know what all these settings do. You'll be able to manually adjust them accordingly. But the fact that there is a button there called Auto, that just makes things so much easier. And whenever you see the Auto button, I'll just highlight it. You can see it up there in the top right-hand corner. Whenever you see an Auto button in an Adobe application, it's applying Adobe Sensei. So just by clicking that one button, now the colors are much more appropriate. All of those settings have been adjusted automatically. You don't need to have a degree in color correction. So that's the great thing about applying AI, is that it's a time saver. And it just really helps, especially if you haven't got a lot of time or training in the areas that you're working in. So just by clicking OK, that's looking so much better. The other part of AI that we've had for a while, which I guess is early form of Gen AI, was to remove objects. So you could just select, there's my daughter, I'm just selecting her now. I did a right click and went to Fill. We named this tool after a guy in the Photoshop team called Phil. It normally gets a bit of a laugh. And
so
when we click
we've
on,
got our mics on mute, but it's a bit like the Ken Burns effect, which is an actual person. Yeah.
And so just by clicking OK now, it's looking, oh, it's done a terrible job. Normally it does a much better job than that, but I'd have to refill that out. But you can see most of my daughter has been removed just by clicking that one button. And so it is a Gen AI tool in its early form, but we've had that for years. And the most recent version of this has been to apply, and it's a brand new tool called Content Aware Move tool, which I'm only just starting to learn myself. And if I click on that, move her over to the right a little bit and click done, you can see how it's filled in the gap. So it's done that automatically, and then I can just move objects around. Now then we start getting into ethical concerns. Well, do you really want to be doing that? Do you really want to be manipulating an image? And I work in the education space. I'm an ex-school teacher. I'm Adobe's senior education specialist. So I use this as an example when I'm working with kids to teach critical thinking, which is what we were just talking about before with Nicky, about how important critical thinking is, and bias and ethics. Critical thinking and critical and creative thinking are key elements of the Australian curriculum and have been since 2010. So this becomes a really lovely opportunity to raise those concepts and ideas with students in a practical way as they manipulate images using these types of tools. And Photoshop is in just about every school now. There's not many schools that don't have access.
Yeah. What are we seeing at Adobe around video? And I suppose not just at Adobe, but in the sort of thinking in the technical space, the big tech companies like yourselves working to develop technologies around video. I think that's because we've spent quite a bit of this session looking at photography. And of course, some of the tools are not available yet. I know people who are very keen to be able to see Sora, for example. And folks who are whitelisted for it, I've seen some work that's posted by them, or they've reposted it from someone else who's got early access, and you go, oh, I really want to have a play with that. So what can you share with us from the tools from Adobe?
So Adobe Premiere Pro is the ultimate of our video tools. We have a range of video tools, from the very simple Adobe Express, which is free, by the way, to Premiere Pro, which is like the ultimate tool that's used at the highest levels of the multimedia industry. Just about every day I see Premiere Pro being used in the news, for instance, when they want to blur out a face or blur out, maybe it's a dead body in a crime scene. And as the camera is moving around, the blurring stays with that object. So that tracking feature is an AI feature within Adobe Premiere Pro. It used to only be in Adobe After Effects, but now we've incorporated that tool into Premiere Pro. More recently, though, there's a fantastic tool that's just come out called text-based editing. Now, this is totally rethinking the idea of traditional video editing, where you can now do your whole editing purely from the text. And I'll give you an example. I'll just bring across, there's a teacher I interviewed last week, just before the school holidays, and I've added her this bit of footage into the timeline. And as I hit play, I probably haven't got the audio working, but what you can see here is you can see the little blue line, which is representing me talking in the background. And I don't want any of me, so I'm just going to select that whole section of me talking and then hit the delete button, and that edit has now been made. So it's using the text to do the editing, which is a really totally different way of thinking. Certainly not something that I've mastered, nor do I want to master it really myself, because I've been trained for years in digital editing with cutting and pasting and in and out points and so on. So I'm very happy to stick with the traditional approach. But when I'm teaching students how to use Premiere Pro for the first time, it's so much more intuitive now for them, because they can see the text, it automatically translates the text, they can bring it in, and then automatically the closed captioning can appear. So it just saves so much time and energy.
Is it non-destructive, Tim, in the sense of, would it keep, so you could always see back to your original?
Absolutely.
Would you be able to save it as a version? So, I mean, one of the use cases I could see with that would be doing a quick and dirty rushes edit on the way back to the office to say, well, these are the bits that I know I want to lose, but I can do the cleanup later on.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's what it was designed for.
Yeah.
And I mentioned Adobe Express earlier. So if you're not familiar with it, it's just the introductory tools into the world of Adobe. And it's browser-based. It's also app-based, and we've incorporated a number of Gen AI features within Adobe Express. So the whole Firefly is now within Adobe Express. So you can do a text to image, you can do a generative fill, you can do a text to template, which is a new feature. Just do a prompt, it'll create a template for you of an infographic or a magazine cover or a worksheet or anything that you think of. You put in the prompt in, it'll create it for you, and then you can just modify it. And text effects is a way of creating fonts that have never existed before. Just by giving a prompt for a particular texture that you want on your font, it'll appear. So it's using the power of Adobe Firefly within Adobe Express, which is really exciting, because we've made this free, totally free of charge, for every K-12 school around the world. And so it's a wonderful opportunity for teachers and students to get involved in this type of technology.
A note to those who have school-aged children to go and lean on them to make your content. or experiment with it. Wonderful. Sorry, I keep interrupting. Please go on.
No, please do. I mean, I'm happy for questions. We've only got a short amount of time, but it was interesting when Shantanu, who's our CEO, was talking about AI last year at Adobe Max, which is our big conference, which we have literally millions of people now, because it's a hybrid event, who are part of it. He said AI will never replace human ingenuity. And that was a really interesting point to make, because there's often this debate is, are we creating this technology that's going to replace people's work? People who are creatives, who spent hours learning how to color grade. It can all happen now just by clicking one button. What's happening with them? So his argument is that AI can enhance creativity by making complicated tasks easier, allowing more time for the creatives to be creative and to not spend so much of their time doing the technical things, which some creatives are arguing about. Look, I put into the chat, it was a fascinating discussion about how confident are we with images that we see that are published. And we now have over 2,000 media organizations and IT companies and anyone who's involved in media, whether it's social media right up to the well-established media firms who are using the Content Authenticity Initiative now. And this is a community of media and tech companies, academics and NGOs who are working to promote the adoption of an open industry standard for content authenticity and provenance. So that logo that TJ mentioned that was on the New York Times imagery, if it's the right one that I'm thinking of, it's probably this one here. It's probably related to the Content Authenticity Initiative because the New York Times is also one of our members. And when you see that logo, then you can click into it and you can then go and work out what's actually the provenance. What was the original image? What did it actually look like? What's happened? If you really are interested in knowing all the modifications that's happened to that image, you can find that all out through this standard, which has been around now for a few years. It was just before COVID where it started. And it literally started with Adobe and a couple of other companies too that realized that we need to fight fake news. And that was the whole initiative behind it.
If Tim, if people want to get involved in the Content Authenticity Initiative, can they reach out to you to learn more?
I'd recommend going to that website there, and I've
Yep.
put it into the chat already.
Great.
I'll put it in again to make it easier.
I'll repost it.
Okay.
Yep.
And that will give you a lot more information on how to join. It's not Adobe. It's Adobe is just one of the founding members of this organization, and it'd be great to have more. So hopefully we'll have 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 by the end of this year who have joined it. The other resource that I thought I'd share with you are, we're constantly writing blogs about AI and so on. This blog I'm about to put into the chat is, if I can find my chat panel again, there it is all about how we're incorporating AI into video. And there's a lot of things, I've done it twice. There's a lot of things that I can't tell you that I've seen demos of that are just blowing my mind. What I don't want to play it now because it'll take too much time, but I encourage you to have a look up on YouTube and look up this YouTube clip. It only goes for a minute or so on Firefly and video to give you a sense of the technology that we're working on for video producers in the future. It blew my mind when I saw it demoed. And I've seen the development since. And the work that we're doing at the moment with Pixar, with DreamWorks and with Disney, I wish I could tell you what I've been seeing in the last couple of weeks. It's just mind-blowing in terms of how we can be creating animation now in seconds rather than months, literally turning months into seconds because of the AI technology that we're developing. Just unbelievable sort of technology.
That feels it feels very typical of the last 6 months, I think.
It does a bit.
Yeah.
There's a link there to all the other blogs too, if you're interested in that. Sorry, Corinne.
No, that's okay. We've probably got another minute or two, and then we might just recap on the homework.
The other thing I just quickly share with you, if you're wanting to know more about how to use our tools, because we've got over 50 tools in the Creative Cloud, 50 tools and resources. This is a one-stop shop. If you ever need any beginner guides or masterclasses on any of the applications, that's a great one-stop shop to go to. And I mentioned Adobe Max. This year it's in Miami, but it's a hybrid event, so anyone can be part of it. And that link is to last year's Max, but it'll also be the link for this year's. Once this year's has been published, it'll be in October. Corinne, is there anything else you wanted me to share?
No, I think that's it. I mean, it's overwhelming and wonderful and rich and delicious, and an opportunity, I think, for folks of us who are such as the winter is in this country, to hunker down perhaps and put our feet up between May and August and start to think about how we want to engage with these tools on evenings where we would, in the summertime, perhaps go to the beach and develop policies. I think one of the things I've taken away from these sessions too is that everybody feels a bit overwhelmed and is trying their best to keep up with a flow of information that seems endless. And so, just to reassure people who are on the call that that's really situation normal. And just with that in mind, TJ, would you mind closing us out with just a recap of the homework. I found the best way to learn something is to have a go at it. And so the registrants of the call will get a link to our closed LinkedIn group where you can post your homework in response to the homework that TJ will now share, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you much, Corin. So just a quick recap. Activity 1 is about describing a photo in as much detail as you can to cultivate visual literacy and enhance your vocabulary in terms of visual terms. Activity 2 is trying to recreate a photograph on your smartphone using AI, see how similar or dissimilar it can be and how difficult or easy it can be depending on the context. Activity 3 is about that introspective policy reflection, seeing how your organization approaches this with policies or how other organizations approach it with policies and how you compare. Activity 4 is about video and using a tool like Runway to have a go at text to video or image to video and having a bit of a play with those processes.
Thank you so much. Well, friends, I will wrap it up there so that we complete on time. I want to thank our wonderful trainers and speakers. So we've had TJ Thompson from RMIT, and who's also an ARC ADM Plus S Automated Decision Making Centre Fellow, Nicky Catley, Group Picture Editor from Australian Geographic, and Dr. Tim Kitchen from Adobe APAC, the Senior Learning Specialist there. I will send everything to everybody, so links to slides, the recording, the handout, and whatever Nicky and Tim wish to share. And of course, if you do have any questions, you can post them in the LinkedIn group, or you can also email me. All right, thank you so much and have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Thank you.